Welcome back. And we're starting now already with our third session, which is called Museums Future Practices. I'm very happy to welcome one of our partners, Dr. Hans Christian Koch from the Humboldt Forum, and he will have a talk about cooperation restitution, museology and related fields of actions. Please.
Dear colleagues, dear friends, first, thanks for the opportunity to speak here. And I will not give an academic lecture today. It's more out of the experiences we have in our fields of museology. I must say I would also like to get a little bit more the perspective of our international partners, because I really think the discussion is a little European-centered. So we have to get a different perspective on that. And just a side remark, the title of the exhibition here, Loot, I don't know, but I think most of you know the word is an Indian word. It's out of the colonial context. The word loot means nothing but war booty. Just remind that. So we just have this dialectic situation, having an exhibition on the topic with a term from a colonial context. So if I talk about the work we do, so among the currently increasing important aspects of the collection histories of different museums, ethnological institutions in particular, and all those located in this environment, they have all to deal with the questions of appropriation and ownership. The collections of material and immaterial cultures, which are naturally to be seen as cultural units, must be emphasized as a central starting point in our discussions. In the current discourse, material cultures are defined by the physical objects of varying characteristics and cultural attribution. The areas of immaterial cultures, and I'm pointing this out, immaterial cultures, are performative practices, knowledge reservoirs, and related documentation in the form of various media such as audiovisual materials are directly related to the material collections we have. The links between the two can often only be established to a limited extent and require academic analysis. In this respect, collection documentation is the central factor, especially with regards to the provenance of tangible and intangible cultural heritage. The circumstances of appropriation and acquisition can be manifold. The spectrum ranges from purchase, theft, appropriation in colonial context, acts of war, in this case looting, copyright infringement, that means legal and ethical principles still diverge in globally setups today, to illegal trade. This contemporary, very important discussion. These areas can also overlap. As far as colonial contexts in particular are concerned, it should be mentioned that knowledge of so-called indigenous law in the 19th century can also be assumed in the case of acquisition. The situation becomes more complex in a global context if it is taken into account that no former colonial context can be assumed, for example, in the Americas in the 19th century. But the phenomenon of coloniality must be, of course, emphasized. Coloniality in particular plays a prominent role when considering the legal issues in the Americas. So the following points must be taken into account. The first thing is, what you see here, the international law is based on European legal systems. Colonial and imperial structures are, of course, intrinsic in this respect. Property claims are heard according to the law of the state in which the property is located. That's the current state, just remind that. The person or institution reclaiming an object must be proof that they are the owner. Keep in mind, we are talking about the situation we have now in dealing with restitution issues. According according to German law, events from the colonial period are time-bound or limited. But the German state waives this principle in most of the cases. In legal consideration and transfers of ownership, the law applicable can at time of transfer be considered. That means that the intertemporal principle is applied and not the current law. Also an important point. We're talking about the law when the acquisition happened. However, this law was generally colonial law. Yet the legal system in former colonies are based on this colonial law. From a global perspective, it is not practicable to override the law at the moment because a lot of different issues will happen in the sovereign nation states in this regard. I will just give you a few examples. The first cooperation restitution context is a direct access to affected communities. In this case, actors in the US, for example, in Canada, on the basis of the NAGPRA, the so-called Native American Grave Repatriation and Repatriation Act. We had a collection from the Chugach of more than 200 objects, and we found out that 9 of the objects are out of illegal context because they were taken out of a grave. So we informed the community and realized soon that the reaction was very positive on the question of restitution. This is what you see here. This happened 2019. These 9 objects went back to the community, to their museums. And the negotiation we had was a very short negotiation. It just took us roughly a year to contact the community, to get the legal papers, and to return the objects. The thing is, the collection is much broader. And John Johnson, you see him here on the picture, he simply said that we were trading for centuries. The other objects are traded objects. You can keep them here, but we have to reconnect to the objects. So please invite us to work on the objects to get a very strong cooperation in the future. And cooperation also means that in the cooperation work with our partners, it might be the case that some objects will also be restituted. This happened in several other cases. I will just give you the next example. Indirect access to affected communities. In this case, actors, let's say, in Australia and New Zealand. They have their own institutions from the government. In this case, on New Zealand, it's the Te Papa Museum. And they take care of everything concerning restitutions. What you see here is the return of the Toimoko, human remains. Our colleagues straight away told us how to proceed, what kind of measurements, what kind of ceremonies we have to undertake. And this is exactly the point where we are following up. That means they had the ceremonies in our storage area. We just handed it over. And in this case, it was very simple for us. They said, you only have to pack it. We take care of all the rest. The custom, the duty, transport, and so on. This even was quicker than the case with the Chugach. I will come to the next cooperation. At state level, with publicly appointed contact persons, such as in Nigeria, in cooperation with the NCMM, the Nigerian Council of Museums and Monuments, in this case, the Benin branch. Everybody of you heard about the case, and I will just give you the short overview what happened. We were just discussing in the Benin Dialogue Group for more than 10 years. Then a delegation came over. You see Barbara Plankensteiner and our colleagues from Nigeria. And the Humboldt Forum, the middle, you see the Crown Prince dressed in red. He was there. We were discussing first on the collection itself, then on the restitution. This was a couple of months before we just transferred the ownership. The object you see on your left side is an object before the looting happened. That means it's the middle of the 19th century, so this object was not returned. So we made a clear cut from which period we return objects. Cooperation, again, means in this case, we are working on the items. What you see here is the scanning of the collection. the now Nigerian collection. This is a computer tomography scanning, which again is costly. We scanned half of the collection. We share the data. We also agreed on the collaboration on the use of these data, on, let's say, reprinting of the objects, trading with the reprints. We just agreed on the money which is involved, shared of the income, and so forth. While researching these, and I think this is an interesting thing where new perspectives are just occurring, while researching also on the material, you might have heard about these, that the bronze, the material, these objects were casted from, are from Germany. In the 16th, 17th centuries, this brass was traded from the Fugger, from the Rhineland to Portugal. They used this as currency for the acquisitions they made in Benin. And this was just transferred over to Benin, and they casted these objects out of it. This is why the so-called restitution study group in the US is reclaiming also these objects for their property. This is something we can discuss a little bit later. I won't go too much into detail in this case. So this will be the next cooperation. This is a state level with which structures still open. Commissions to be formed between nation states and their communities. In this case, Cameroon. Cameroon is in so far a challenge also for us that we are talking about 360 kingdoms, former kingdoms in the whole space of Cameroon. So you can't negotiate with all separate kingdoms in the case of restitution. So when we opened the Humboldt Forum, we had a delegation from Cameroon with us, some colleagues from the National Museum, and only a couple of months later, they constituted a commission for illegal exported cultural objects from Cameroon. This commission went into action in February this year. We had a visit 3 weeks ago, to Germany, traveling through Germany, having a look to the different collections. And what you see here is the so-called Ngonso figure from the So people. This is agreed that this will be returned. We are just waiting for the procedure from the Cameroonian side. Sorry. So the next picture again from Cameroon. You might have heard about the throne. And this is an incident, positive one insofar that the whole community of the Bamoun, the Sultan of Bamoun, when he came over to Germany, assembled in Berlin at the Humboldt Forum. So we had something like 250 diaspora communities all dressed up. And why I'm showing this is that the situation in the exhibition is special, especially concerning the restitution questions, because this is not questions for restitution from the Sultan itself. We can discuss also about this a little bit later. But I switched off the alarm system because I figured out that something might happen. He came with a king mother, so his mother, and I was just talking to her when he was just sitting suddenly on the throne in the exhibition, which was special for us, you know, TV cameras around, the whole discussion, shouting, clapping, and so on. And then he was saying something very interesting to the people. He's saying, we are here. We are not responsible for what happened 100 years ago, but we are responsible to settle it now. And this is cooperation, of course, also restitution, but something to share our history. I just leave it with this. So what we are just again talking about is the cooperation restitution. And we are not there to talk about, let's say, a European strategy on restitution. Something I think is definitely important, as we just have different aspects on our partner side. I'm just going back to the partner side with a very short statement. If we just talk on the fields and focusing on restitution, we have different questions open. That means the first question is the transfer of ownership. What does it mean? In which way we just proceed if we talk about restitution? The next step is reconsolidation. Some of our partners from Africa don't ask for the restitution of the whole collection. They just look at their collection, what they still have, and what they need to complete their collection in the country. We had this experience with Namibia. They wanted to have specifically collections, pre-colonial collections, because they wanted to show that there was a history before colonial history. Also a very important issue. We have to talk about re-establishment of ritual objects and practices. This is something we have seen with a partner from Colombia, the Kogi. They needed their masks for certain rituals back. So we returned it also this year. This is again a new issue because the acquisition was not illegal. It was under an asymmetrical power situation, but nevertheless, it was a legal acquisition, and I already said Colombia was not a colony. Also legally an important point. The next thing is repatriation of human remains, and this is something we have in a very strong strategy in some countries like Australia, New Zealand, also in this case Namibia. Other countries don't have this as their first priority, and I don't go into details. Even if we research in Germany, and we have done this in certain areas, and we have the provenance, it's not the case that everybody is willing to take it back now. I'm not taking never, but now. You can also talk about the speed a little bit. And of course, there is something like a question we always have, and nobody talks so much about, is the situation of contamination. Most of the collections in ethnological museums have used biocides in the past. So we have to inform our partners, this is what we do. We did research on these situations, so we know what kind of substances are in, how to clean it. But we have to inform our partners in a very strict way how to treat these objects in future, how to preserve them, and this is a question of capacity building and future cooperation. Coming back to the standardized European perspective, I think we have to, to work also from a European perspective in the sense of provenance research to more together. We have this network already established 3 years ago on a joint provenance research, because we know that a lot of objects were traded inside Europe to different museums. So we have certain trading houses. And we only can find out where these objects are coming from if we have all the different connections and trade routes also inside Europe. Just one last example on the Benin bronze. We had 514 objects. Only 180 are from the auctions in Great Britain. All the rest was traded straight in Nigeria. So it was bought and traded in Nigeria and came over to Germany. So you also have your trading routes in the country of origin at the same time. This is something you have to prove to understand where objects are coming from and where they might have belonged to. I'll stop here because I really think we have some more discussions open, and I hope I was in time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that is very interesting. All the topics you pointed out, and I think it's very well. Germany, we know, is one of the first to also really connect to the countries of origin to cooperate, and a lot has been said about that already in the press. But I think it's room for discussion with a lot of things you mentioned here for later on.
Sure.
Thank you so much. And our next speaker is from the Allard Pierson Museum in Amsterdam, Laurien de Gelder. She's a curator there, and she just told me in the break, archaeology is always a bit late to the party, but they are to the party because they started their provenance research quite recently, and Laurien is gonna tell us about it.
Thank you so much, Judith. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Laurien de Gelder, and indeed I'm a curator at the Allard Pierson, the Institute of the University of Amsterdam. And I'm a curator of a part of the archaeological collections. As Judith mentioned, indeed, archaeologists are fairly late to the provenance party. And maybe also we are kind of the socially awkward, uninvited cousin to the party, because our set of problems is somehow related, but also somehow different. We also have our own set of problems. But I was very happy to hear that Martine started this day with an example of an archaeological site, the Roman Forum. We will talk about that more from now on. Yeah, so also my talk will not be a very academically theoretical framed talk, but more of a experience, yeah, part of my daily job. So the practice that I'm dealing with the archaeological collections. Yeah, so the Allard Pierson started off in 1934 as the Allard Pierson Museum in Amsterdam. And its core is an archaeology collection, a university museum with a focus on the three pillars of civilization. So ancient Egypt, ancient Near East, and the ancient classical world. And it started off at the Sarfatistraat in 1976. It reopened in the former National Bank of the Netherlands, in the city center of Amsterdam at the Rokin. So since the opening of the museum in 1934, the archaeological collections now encompass around 19,000 objects, which is not so much, but also not so few in a way. So I will be talking about Mediterranean collections, mainly, and collections from Northern Africa and the ancient Near East. And they came here through means that are problematic for one way or another, but they're not all that problematic. It doesn't mean that all objects have a problematic background. But museums have been for a long time, at least museums with archaeological collections maybe especially, have been quite reluctant to do something with the problematic history of their collections. Maybe also because if you can pinpoint the problems, it also means that you have to act upon it. And for us, for the Allard Pierson, it meant starting this provenance process that we drastically had to adjust our acquisition policy, which makes it fairly impossible actually to still acquire objects which have a fully clean provenance, so to say. And next to that, we started earlier this year the provenance project, which meant that we had to invest a lot of time, money, people in order to do so. So the reasons for the Allard Pierson to really start this provenance journey is because we received over the last 5 years various claims to restitute objects. And I'm now only talking about the archaeological collections. And we try to deal with this cases, with this request per object, of course, but the requests kept piling up. So what we wanted to do is to move away from this reactive approach of a claim comes in and we have to react. We wanted to have a more integral approach. And we do so by having a more active attitude. So we are actively doing provenance research where we can with the source countries, but also in settling the claims, we try to settle more on ethical grounds instead of the whole juridical way, which takes a long time and a lot of money. So therefore, we have started a large-scale research project into the provenance history of our entire archaeological collection. So in the second session today, there was a discussion whether to focus on some objects or instead of revising your whole collection. Of course, we are prioritizing, but we really want to have, the end goal is to have a full focus on all objects, which will take a long time, but still, that's the goal for now. Yeah, and it also didn't help that our problematic history was often mentioned in the media, which is good in a way. So we heard Eline talk this morning about the legal framework, so it's also not my specialty, so I won't dive into that, but a bit I want to say about the UNESCO 1970 convention, because this is the initial moment in the 1970s that the notion of respecting the cultural property of different countries, source countries, was initiated, and also the awareness of how to respect each other's property laws came into place, and also not to import antiquity without an export license, for example. Also, at the same time, I think the recognition came into being that the art market was very incentivizing to the looting and destruction of cultural objects and heritage sites, depriving countries of their national heritage. Nevertheless, and I speak here for from my practice, from my perspective, the raised widespread awareness in this practice, there was simultaneously another way of thinking that prevailed in this notion of protecting heritage sites, and that was that the museum sector, a large part of the museum sector also saw this heritage as a more global enterprise, global citizenship, heritage of humanity that transcends national borders in a way. So this way of thinking was very much in tension with this UNESCO, with this UNESCO convention, and also made, caused a sort of stasis in the museum world. A shift in the public opinion on this protection of heritage, of archaeological heritage, came in the course of the 2000s, starting in 2003 with the Iraq War, also and the looting of the museum in Baghdad, also the unraveling of looting networks in mainly Italy came to light, and a lot of public shaming of museums and individual collectors happened, and that accelerated the need to at least try to use that UNESCO convention even more. It only happened in 2009 that the Netherlands ratified the UNESCO convention. I don't have to tell you, I guess. We can't, and that means we can't acquire anything that we can't prove that left its country of origin prior to 1970. That line in the sand was in many ways very helpful to put a halt slightly on the illicit trafficking of objects, but for us in the Allard Pierson, for example, was one of the consequences that it took another decade to apply this UNESCO convention, so having this fully documented provenance history to your collection. It took another decade that we also applied that to our passive acquisitions. So at first, when the ratification happened in 2009, the UNESCO convention was a line in the sand for active acquisitions, but it took another 10 years, up until fairly recently, that we also applied that for passive acquisitions, which is quite odd because the history of our collection actually is very much tied into to the group of friends of the museum around the museum, which donated quite often their collection to the museum. So what we're doing in the Allard Pierson, as I said, we started at the beginning of this year. And we do have a focus. Our goal is to research the entire collection, but we focus on the interim period now between 1970 and 2009, the ratification date of the UNESCO Convention in the Netherlands. And the track record of our object is quite sketchy, unclear, and not always that straightforward. But we started with unlocking our archival resources. So this is really the backbone of your collection, the administration, the archive, the metadata around your around your collection, which wasn't really wasn't that much integrated into our object history so far. So what we are doing now is we are researching the museum archive. So for example, we revise minutes by former curators to see whether on what basis objects were acquired, in what circumstances, etc. We're also looking at the archive of the Friends, the Association of Friends of the Museum, because they funded a lot of acquisitions in the past. So, and also we use, of course, a lot of external sources. And we are trying to do also archival research together in collaboration with the source countries, because as I mentioned earlier, the unraveling of looting networks also brought to light a lot of archives that sometimes deal with collection objects in our collection. So digitization and object photography is very important for us. We are, as the Allard Pierson Museum, so the museum collection is part of the university library, so it took a while that we got our own collection registration system, but now we have one, and we find it, we deem it very important to add all our metadata into that system, also the provenance research, and make that available to the public, where photography is of course very important, because a lot of the times also with archaeology you have former inventory numbers on the bottom side of a vase, for example. So also exposes provenance, the history of provenance in the object itself to the public. So along the lines of the research, we also want to improve the public engagement. This is a poster of an exhibition I made with the master students museum studies at the University of Amsterdam earlier this year, and the exhibition evolved around one object, and the students focused on the period. This object is claimed by the Italian state, and it's very likely that it will be restituted. And the students focused on the question on what do we do with objects when we know they're leaving, what do we do in this interim period? How do we say goodbye in a way to objects? So I thought it was a very relevant question for our practice. Also, we deem it important to make accessible our data, of course, of the provenance research, in the hope that other external research can add to that data. We are preparing an exhibition on provenance research and restitution, and of course, as a university institute, we stimulate the debate on the topic of illicit trade in antiquities, and we publish about it. Also, we like once half a year we hold expert meetings to discuss the practice and the process of the practice. Yeah, and one of the public tasks we have is also to make intervention in our permanent collection. So here you see the collector's cabinet that was installed in 2015, but immediately when it was installed, it already got critiqued, because we show here a part of the history of our collection, and we highlight a few of the collectors that donated for various reasons their collections to the museum. But the critique was that we do not say anything about the power imbalance on that happened when the objects came to the Netherlands, for example, and we weren't as explicit as we maybe should have been. So what we want is to make like physical interventions to show the public that, okay, in 2015 we fought this way, but now we are progressing in our thinking, and also invite the public to react. One of the main targets for this provenance research is the cultural collaboration we want to install with the source countries. At this moment, we are dealing mainly with Italy for the restitution of claimed objects, but we want to what we want in the future is to have a close collaboration where we can not only let them know about their research, but we can inform each other about the research, and yeah, we can make agreements on maybe long-term loans, for example. And hopefully we can use the example of Italy to also establish those relations with other source countries, for example, Egypt, Greece. But that's, as you know, is not a one-on-one task. Also, what I wanted to address, that doing provenance research also can cause some organizational turmoil. For example, with us, the museum has a long tradition of friends of the museum that were sometimes also private collectors and donated their collection to the museum. And with our new acquisition policy, it means that we can no longer accept those collections, which means we have to, establish new relations with those friends, which is kind of a emotional labor in a way. Also, there's this generation. No, it's not always intergenerational, but also there's a changing relation of the curator with the private collectors. Sometimes that are friends, sometimes they're not, and the market actors. And that's also a transition that takes time to really settle in. And what we want to avoid is to criminalize our predecessors. So what we want, and we're doing that by doing an oral history project on the history of our museum. So we understand better in which ways, in which historical contexts collections were acquired, in order to avoid that criminalization of past practices. I want to leave it to this. This QR code gives you access to our provenance page. And I would like to thank you all for your attention. Also, by the means of Rogier Kalkers, Head of Provenance Research at the Allard Pierson. So, you can also contact him or contact me if you have any more questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Laurien. And we are so well on time, everyone. That's great. Thank you. Our next speaker is Professor of History at the University of the Western Cape, Siraj Rasool. The title is Restitution and the Museum as a Process. Thank you.
If I look slightly funny, it's because I have my head in a clamp that enables the microphone to project my voice. So I want to talk as someone who comes from a society that was marked by multiple colonialisms, but that also experienced a struggle for freedom, that went through an anti-apartheid struggle and struggles against legacies of colonialism, and that became a democracy in 1994, which posed severe challenges for the museums in South Africa. So I come from a society that has sought ways to decolonize the museum. And I'll explain to you what that has meant in the National Museum in Cape Town. But I also am fortunate to have been able to participate in experimental projects on how to rethink what we mean by museum. And I'm one of the founders of what I still can say is the most important museum in the world in Cape Town, the District 6 Museum, which many of you will know about and many of you have visited. And I want to talk about how we can draw upon the methodologies of the District 6 Museum for the work of restitution. And clicker. So I don't want to bore you with histories that you are very well aware of, but I want to make a distinction in this presentation between what we can call museums of containment, or museum as confinement, which is the 19th century museum, the modern museum, the museum that was marked by disciplines, the museum that is a domain of governmentality, of the governance of collections. And sometimes we go through our discussions about restitution within the framework of the museum of containment as a means of extending the governing of the collections by thinking about how to transfer the location of the collections. So one of the fundamental characteristics of the museum of containment that you will know about, that is the character of museums in this society, it's a character of museums in Germany, and it continues to mark us in South Africa as we struggle with this legacy. And that is the distinction between the museum for the collections of those deemed to be civilized and the governance of the collections of those deemed to be uncivilized, in the distinction between the Museum of Cultural History and the Museum of Ethnologie, the Ethnological Museum. And you've seen all of these dances of death in which ethnological museums have tried to rebrand themselves for a new world and redefine themselves as world museums. You've seen the amazing example in front of all of our eyes in which, I mean, I've made this argument to last before, you won't mind me making it again, namely that in order to be a self-respecting European society, you need a major ethnological museum in your capital city. And so the making of the Humboldt Forum was very much about the ongoing process of the Europeanization and the Westernization of Germany. So it's quite interesting how the concepts that we have used in the earlier panels, in which we presume these to be quite unproblematic terms. The idea of Westernness is not a habitus, it's a politics. It is a determination of where you want to be and who you want to be aligned with. So one of the major challenges in South Africa was to demolish the barrier between cultural history and ethnology, to decommission that classificatory division. And so in Iziko Museums of South Africa, they created a special new division called social history. So, but there are no triumphs here, because these are all new developments that we all are struggling with. And so how you do the collections management in this new division, how you bring the different ceramic collections that had previously been segregated into a new democratic museum remains a challenge that we all experience. So I also want to talk to you about colonialism, because in the back of our minds we're talking about colonialism, and we need to make certain distinctions. And if you move between languages, we mean different things. In certain languages that we have in this room, we don't have certain concepts. And I'll explain to you that our German colleagues actually don't have a word for restitution. Our German colleagues have, their word is Rückgabe. And I've noticed that our Dutch colleagues are also now following the Germans and using Teruggabe as their concept. Well, Rückgabe is a giving back. It is a gesture of return. It is not restitution. Restitution is a politics of demand. It is doing so on the terms of the former colonized. And so we have an ongoing struggle happening right now in these projects in different parts of the world as we celebrate the initiatives and the proaction on the part of some of our colleagues in Germany and in other societies. We have to recognize that what we have at play at the moment is a struggle, a contest between the politics of repatriation, Rückgabe, which is a giving, and a politics of restitution, which is a demanding on the terms, on which terms do returns occur. And so restitution is really only going to work if we can build, in our case, African claiming capacities. That what you have here is not just a cleansing of the blood of our hands in Europe by giving back after provenance research. Because merely a giving back and a celebration in an African parliamentary garden or presidential garden is not going to solve the problems that we are dealing with. And I'm going to put to you what one of my main arguments is here, that restitution is not an event to be celebrated in a garden or on African soil on the day that the boxes arrive on the plane. Restitution is going to be with us for a very long time, certainly for our generation and beyond, where we are talking about restitutionary work that needs to happen, restitutive work. We are still finding the language for this. And, of course, the restitutionary work has to happen alongside what we can think of as reparatory work, the work of repair. Because yes, we do have a model of reparations from many different examples, some of which we've spoken about on earlier panels, in which reparations is 'n kwessie van geldsake. That reparations is a matter of payment. That's one element, and there are many examples that we can refer to here. You know the work of the Compensation Commission. You know that in the case of British colonialism and slavery at the Cape, Mauritius, and the Caribbean, that the owners of enslaved people were paid out by the British government, right? So you're talking about reparations as payment as an important question. But more important to me is the work, the social work of repair, the community work of repair. And right now we don't have models, except that I need to talk to you what lies behind this. These multiple colonialism. We've got, in South Africa, we've got, as you know, the mercantile colonialism of the VOC. And in wat dit beteken, I can speak this language because of that. We have a British colonialism of slavery and of capitalism. But we also have an internal colonialism when South Africa became an independent nation in 1910 of white people of people who were made white by the British over black people. And then we have our own South African colonialism over Namibia. So South Africa is a very peculiar society of a colonial victim and a colonial overlord. And so when you attend to colonial legacies and restitution, there's a lot of multi-directional work that needs to occur, that needs to happen in your process of your ongoing democratization. And we learn how complicated a society like Namibia is, with having had that German colonialism severed and hanging in space until a later date, and where we have a peculiar form taking place, giving shape to the restitution claims, in which the authority of the Namibian state is sometimes not recognized. And we have the peculiar case of Germany itself, which lost its colonies at the end of World War I. A society that did not go through the disciplinary transformations in history and anthropology, which required you to face freedom movements, to go through those changes. And so Germany is almost like a 19th century museum of disciplines and museums of these kind of untransformed spaces, now suddenly dealing with decolonization, with jumping through stages, and without thinking about what it means to have an Ethnologisches museum, what it means to have, I mean, German universities don't have African history, for example, because they didn't go through those. The discipline of studying African societies is ethnologie. The disciplinary nature of museums is so fascinating in Germany. Orientalische Kunde, and all kind of 19th century disciplines. I mean, my discussions that I've had with colleagues in Germany about these things are very interesting. So, okay, let me get to the PowerPoint. Okay, so we've gone through some of these discussions, all of these disciplinary challenges that we have here in, I mean, our art history field in South Africa used to be known as cultural history of Western Europe, because it was about the canon of Western art history. And I've only realized very recently how revolutionary it was to be trained in that subfield of African history, which is a kind of an idea of Geschichte, of geschiedenis, that recognizes historicity without written sources. And that is a revolutionary development. And that, so if you do not have an anthropology or an ethnology that exists alongside the insistence on the historicization, on the historicity of African people, then you can't have some of these discussions effectively that we are having. And of course, and the reason why I'm needing to present these issues is because the way in which we are experiencing the German processes of Rückgabe and Provenienzforschung mit Rückgabe and the desire to return is that it comes to us through the way German museums are governed and through in the way in which German society is governed in a highly federated way, where our colleagues in the different museums in the different lenders thought that they can go directly to communities to say, we want to return your things, not recognizing the authority of the nation. And the trouble that we have is that I'm an advisor to the Van Luschan collection in Berlin, also fall under the Preußischer Kulturbesitz, and we only deal with what we call human remains, another terrible museum concept, because human remains is an objectifying term. So when you go through your restitution process, the first stage that you do is you go through a de-accession process. This is what we are learning. You go through a process of de-accessioning. You take it out of your collection. We invented an Afrikaans word for that because we didn't have one. We call it ontboek. You take it out of the book, right? So you de-accession. And once you de-accession, the geraamtes are no longer human remains. They are ancestral remains. They are the remains of human beings. They're not objects any longer. In the same way as when you decide to return objects, another terrible museum concept. It's a museum term of governance. You remove it from the governance of the museum. You refer to these as belongings that had been objectified. So you go through a de-objectification process. So there are all kinds of things that we are learning, because in our work in Freiburg and in Göttingen and elsewhere on the return of human remains, the question arises, who speaks for the dead? What are the disciplines of the dead? And yes, we went through a process to say that it needs to be multidisciplinary. You need to have historians alongside your other disciplines. But what we know is that human biologists, formerly referred to as physical anthropologists, cannot speak for the dead. Instead, we learn from what our colleagues went through in Berlin, and they're about to have another conference there. In a sense, the activists there, Berlin postcolonial, very important sources of pressure that we haven't even begun to speak about, of the work of the activists in European cities, of diaspora activists, is they became a community of care. And one of the things that we are learning is how much we need communities of care in these processes of restitution. So I want to, before I come to that slide, I reverse them. I will quickly just spend a minute or two talking about the museum as process, in which museum is not the collection. Museum is not the building. The museum is the process of the ongoing sharing and exchange and contest of knowledge that is involved in the project. So the museum that we are talking about now is not the governance of a collection. There might be a collection, and there is a long scholarship on the work of the District 6 Museum, not just community museum, but with a methodology of transaction, of what we call interrogation, an interrogative museum. But I like to think of it as a museum of process, in which the museum has transactions and performances and intergenerational work on its map, on the landscape of District 6 itself, as it comes to term with questions of history and memory. And these methodologies, I think, can be extended to what we are referring to as restitution. Because restitution is not an event that is going to happen overnight and that will end on one day. Restitution is going to be with us for a while. And I want to argue to you that restitution is the new museum. We are entering a new phase of rethinking what we mean by museum. That the restitutive work that we are doing, for which there is no model, is going to be with us for a while. You collected in that society, now you have a lifelong debt to that society. You are in a permanent relationship with that society. Restitution doesn't mean an end of that relationship, because what we are talking about here is ongoing restitution work as a fundamental element of decolonization. And decolonization is extremely difficult work, because colonialism does not simply exist in the past. Colonialisms continue to live with us. They live together when they come in multiple forms. They shape who we are, and as we battle with those colonial legacies, we try to shape ourselves in ways that depart from the terms that we were made by colonialism. So these are ongoing struggles, people, and I want to urge us to think about these new museologies that take place in Kenya, they take place in South Africa, they importantly occur in Latin America. They do not occur in English, they occur in Portuguese and Spanish. I've had enormous privilege to spend time in the Museu de Maré in Rio de Janeiro, in the Ecomuseu de Amazonia on the Amazon River outside of Belém de Pará, and to learn about these new ways in which museums are being made and remade are enormously interesting. And that was what lay behind the definition of the museum that was developed for UNESCO. And I was a part of the UNESCO Advisory Committee on the new definition that predated the debate that took place in ICOM. In those days, ICOM said that UNESCO is being opportunistic in redefining a museum. And you know what struggles took place in ICOM much later. And you know that we now are moving towards a situation where we do not think of museums in the same way as the 19th century museum of governmentality. Museum must become a domain of futures and freedom. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was very interesting. Also the definitions. It's a lot about the meaning of words today, and you gave that actually also quite a new meaning. So if you could take place, and I would like to invite the other speakers as well to have a seat. And I can imagine that the both of you talk a lot. Actually, I have talked a lot already in the past about having a lot of discussions about the whole subject, because it's so interrelated, this whole relationship going on and on. So we were talking about law also, but we're also talking about relationships, and can you react on each other's talk? Hans Christian. Because we would like to be taken with you.
Stout.
So shall I start?
Yes, please.
Okay. As you already said, we know each other for quite some time now. Also working together, and I just kept this for the discussion, just explaining what we do at the moment in the museum. So we have a project at the moment, we call it the Collaborative Museum. That means we are investing money for the next 3 years on collaborations, on residency work. We have a specialist now for restitution employed. Definitely provenance research is a very strong point. These are permanent positions. And we are inviting up to 10 residencies per year. And these are not scientists, no researchers. They are from the communities, they are artists, they are educationalists, and they are also journalists. So we want to get the full spectrum of museum work into the museum and an active part of the exhibition and the future work we do. I think this is up to a certain degree what Shiraz is talking about. We definitely have to consider the future in the sense getting the collections we have into the contemporary time and contemporary structures. And just the word restitution we use is not because we don't have a word for it, but this actually means, in the meaning of itself, restitution to get the same situation back how it was 100 years ago. This is definitely not what we are doing. So mind that. You can't restitute the situation of 100 years ago. And this is what we are just negotiating at the moment. We have to see what happened in the last 100 years and how we deal with it today. That's exactly what the Sultan of Bamun said. We are not responsible, but we have to take care now, and we have to change it now.
And can you say something about what is going on in Germany right now? You are part of the negotiation, but on the other hand, there are also parts you would rather see differently, I suppose.
No, there's absolutely no doubt that in a very short time, since I started working in Germany 10 years ago, initially at Museum, the World Museum in Frankfurt, and then later these different ethnological museums. After having worked with Paul Vogt at Tropenmuseum decades ago, having started at a time when one of the then leaders of the Humboldt Forum project as it was being made, Horst Bredekamp, we were at a conference together in Bonn, and he said some remarkable things, including that Germans are extremely fortunate that their colonial experience was so short, because Germans are remarkably untouched by colonialism. Now, you'd be shocked to hear that now, but, you know, because the level of admission, you know, could it be because this was the society that committed the Holocaust? Could it be because this is a society that had to reckon with itself and violent histories? That the slow realization of how colonialism weighed down upon it. Even 2016, the most incredibly powerful exhibition on colonialism in the German Historical Museum. But it placed colonialism in the past. Today it can't do that. And a lot needs to be said for the activism, that ongoing activism that happens in different German cities. That is one of the elements that pushes this debate. But, you know, our German colleagues are, you know, right from the Ministry of Culture, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they take advice. You know, the Goethe Institute, whose name I much prefer in Brazilian Portuguese, Instituto Goethe. When you take all of these institutions as they were being formed, as they are, this is an energy and a set of programs that, you know, need to behold. I mean, right now, where the Humboldt Forum can present itself as one of the leading lights of decolonization. I mean, it's extraordinary. You know, and to turn that into practical programs and how you do that. But you do get some museums. I'll give you one example of a former ethnological museum that's now also called Museum, you know, World Museum or something like that. And all of you will know the work that comes out of Oceania on curatorship and co-curatorship, how we partner with each other and we partner with local communities. You know the work of James Clifford and co-curatorship and so forth. The museum brought a Samoan curator to work in the museum. And you know what they called the title of his job? Co-curator. I mean, that is just such a weak application of a theory of museum making. You know, to turn someone into to subordinate someone into an appendage is just not what the theory is about. Now that would never happen in the Humboldt Forum, but it happened in another major German city. You know, and I mean, let's just take two further examples. They are amazing examples to behold, as we've been talking about loot in this conference, as we've been talking about Washington principles. We look at the two museums that currently, or that this year, have had farewell exhibitions to Benin bronzes. We look at those two examples. You look at the Museum an Rottenbaum in Hamburg, Kunst und Kultur, where Barbara Plankensteiner is one of the world experts on Benin bronzes, right? Now, you know that when you decide in your collection that those have been stolen from Holocaust victims, you don't put them on display any longer. I would think. But they had a farewell exhibition that did an ethnological explanation of the objects. For the last time and the first time, all the Benin collections together in an exhibition. Whereas in Cologne, the character of the farewell exhibition was like a hall of mourning of a violent history, a mourning methodology. So two very different kinds of exhibitions. At the moment, what is happening in all of these museums needs to be watched. We need to look at, we need to distinguish between them, because we are experimenting with this new time of reckoning with colonialism, where, quite frankly, some of our European societies are trying to do exactly strategically what is the move so that we can do the right thing and at the same time hold on to the determination of the outcome. Right?
We can listen all afternoon to you. And we are all doing that. You know, everyone is completely silent. But I see Laurien nodding very...
Yeah.
And I was thinking, what do you take for this, for your... museum represents your collection, I mean, and the way you're approaching provenance research, but then...
Yeah. Well, you voiced it way more eloquently than I did, but the main thing you said, that restitution is not a moment. It's not a picture. It's not an image of governmental people handing over objects. It's an ongoing process, and that's actually, in a way, what we want to establish is this the more focus on collaboration and not so much of giving back. Oh, there. Yeah, so it's an ongoing process. That's what I took out of it the most. But yeah, I'm still a bit overwhelmed by.
Cheer up. Who isn't? Who isn't?
Yeah.
Are there any questions from the room? I see many hands. Can you remember all of them if I do them all at once? And you? And you?
Try.
Can I have a microphone? It's in the middle. There were some hands over there. Can the hands be raised again, because Daphne otherwise doesn't know? Oh, look at that. There's someone in the center lane here. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Laurie Cosmo from Leiden University, and I have a question for the Humboldt Forum colleague. And it's just a question about facts. I'm curious to know more about the sources for the Benin bronzes. You mentioned that a small percentage of them came from England, and a larger percentage came from Africa. And I'm just curious about what those sources were.
Inside Nigeria, from different chiefdoms, different inside traders, because you must see when the looting was happening in Benin, these were not only Britishers. We all know that they have a lot of African soldiers with them. This was the actual army. I would say at least 2/3 of the army were just African soldiers. And the plundering was going on in a huge scale. So a lot of these things also just landed up on the Nigerian market. And then you had commissions in Nigeria, so people were asking for these objects because they were getting very interested, especially in Germany. So they asked some traders, German traders in Nigeria, to get these objects, and they were just looking for it and just acquired it. This is almost 2/3 of the collections we have was coming through these channels over Hamburg then and then into Berlin. So this is something which is really interesting in the sense that we always think, the Britishers looted the whole thing, but they opened up also a market. And this market was just pertaining inside Africa.
Which is also problematic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But this is something you have in different things. And when I was talking about the material, you see it's a kind of circle. They manufactured these brass inside Germany in the 16th century. The Fugger, one of the richest families of ever, they traded it with the Portuguese, and they traded again palm oil, enslaved humans, and so on, with the Benin Kingdom. And this special material from Germany was so interesting for them because it was a high amount of lead into it, kind of metal, so that the casting was easier because the material was a little softer. And this is something you can find out. And then the whole thing, the circus started again. So it's not that single-sided and simple as we always think.
Thank you.
Well, and behind it, there was another question. Yes, there. Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Sasha Rossman from the University of Bern. I guess I have just a general question for everyone, but maybe more for Suraj, which is, let's see if I can express this. Because I feel like it's been floating around the room a bit, but it hasn't been really spoken about directly. But if we acknowledge that colonialism and capitalism are so intrinsically intertwined with one another, how is it that the museum as restitution, it must then necessarily be an anti-capitalist or a capitalist critical process of restituting? And so how is it that the restitutive museum and can also be, or must also be, a capitalist critical space when also these museums continue to be national museums that are bound up in national politics that are also capitalist politics? So what could that look like, or what would that restitutive work of decolonizing be, also in terms of including anti-capitalist decolonization?
You can. Yeah?
Yeah. I mean, that's an extremely thought-provoking question. And I don't have easy answers, but let me think along with your question. And I would first go to one of my postdoctoral fellows, Dr. Sophie Schazippen, a German scholar of Southern African collections in Austria, who insists on cultural value in museums and heritage value being thought of alongside economic value. And if we go back to the example of the Compensation Commission in Britain and the work done at University College, then cultural value in the way that we understand histories of enslavement must be related to economic value. And the records of the Compensation Commission enable you to directly calculate what families, where in England and Scotland, benefited from being compensated for losing their enslaved people on emancipation. But even more than that, as someone who was taught in the underground to become a Marxist and used that theory to study at a white university on a permit, I have come to understand myself that there are deeper struggles that we need to undertake while holding that economic history and the economic character of exploitation in mind. And that is, we have an infrastructure that is epistemic, that exists around that economic exploitation, and that masks it, that conceals it, and places it in certain kinds of social understandings of us as people in society. And the museum is the fundamental institution, I've argued in many places, of empire. And they continue to reproduce empire, and they reproduce certain kinds of economic relations without seeming to met eerste oogopslag. But when we think of dismantling this epistemic infrastructure and replacing it with something else that values humanity, that values fundamental equality, that values equality between all of us in the world. When we dismantle that infrastructure of how we easily talk of ourselves as Western, and how we easily divide the world into this is Africa, but that part of Africa belongs to the Middle East. And as we carve the world up in knowledge systems, when we do that kind of dismantling, I think we do more than that. We also fundamentally are calling for a transformation and a kind of revolution of the economic structures of society. There's absolutely no doubt about that. So my project of decolonizing museums and rethinking museum is bound up with a fundamental revolutionary understanding of remaking the world.
Thank you so much. I'll just leave it at that. Sorry, Klaas, because we can talk for hours, and I think it sort of challenges us to make a new panel and get a discussion the whole afternoon, because I think it's very interesting what is said here, what is said in the last session, but unfortunately we're on a schedule, and so there's a tea break, and then we go to the last session, which will also be very interesting, I assure you.